Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over the last two series, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the area of human rights. In this series, we turn our attention to the struggle to end modern slavery. I'm Todd. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we're discussing geospatial analysis of slavery. My guest today is Dr. Doreen Boyd, Associate Professor and Reader in Earth Observation in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. Her research is focused on ecosystems, such as tropical rainforests, temperate peatlands, boreal forests, and mountains. She's recently turned her attention to geospatial analysis of slavery using satellite technologies and remote sensing. So welcome, Doreen. It's great to have you here on this episode of the Rights Track.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So I guess I'm going to start with a very simple question. You head up this project called Slavery from Space, and if someone reads that phrase straight off, what does slavery from space mean?
Okay, great question. I think the first thing to say is that we're not actually counting slaves from space, so let's get that out of the way. What we're doing is exploiting technology that is around us all the time. We're actually exploiting a natural phenomenon, which is the fact that we can record images of the Earth. So we have satellites going round and round, polar orbiting satellites and geostationary satellites, that provide us with photographs and a record of what's going on the Earth's surface at any one time. So rather than looking at things like tropical rainforests and mountains and boreal forests that I have been doing for the last 20 years or so, what we can do is start to look at other imprints on the Earth's surface, such as industries that tend to use slave labour.
So satellites circling the Earth, I mean, there are thousands of them out there, right? And every day it seems there's a private company or a government sending a satellite into space. And the satellites go into orbit, they rotate around the Earth, and just to give us a sense of the scale, how much of the Earth's surface are they taking pictures of?
So that varies from satellite to satellite.
Okay.
So we have certain satellites, such as the Landsat satellite, which will take an area of around 185 kilometres by 185 kilometres at any one time, and it will repeat orbit at a particular place on the Earth's surface twice a month.
But does it cover the whole Earth at some point, or do you have to aggregate images from different satellites?
Absolutely, you have to aggregate it together. So for Great Britain, for example, to get a cloud-free image of Great Britain would take about 2 years.
Wow, okay.
Simply because of the cloud problem.
Yeah.
You can get lots of images that are cloudy, and you can do that probably within a month or so.
Yeah,
but
my experience is this
free,
country is always cloudy.
Absolutely, that's it.
Yeah, they tell us, in my part, I live in East Anglia mostly, and they always say that we have less rainfall than the state of Israel, but I've never actually believed that statistic because it always seems quite cloudy. But so it's about clarity of image, and equally, what about the resolution? So how far down can you get to the Earth's surface? So what sort of square meterage do you have a clear shot of?
Absolutely. So the expensive satellite, i.e. the one that you have to pay for, will give you meters resolution.
Okay.
So you can see cars, basically.
Okay.
The free satellite data, you can't see the cars at all. You know, my students always say, "Oh, it's really blurry." Yeah,
so they're quite pixelated images.
They're pixelated. Yeah. They're 30 metres by 30 metres in their resolution. But that's improving. So the European Space Agency launched a series of satellites called Sentinels, and that's got us down to 10 metres. So you can see building quite easily. So that's where we're really trying to exploit the data for the slavery project.
Sure, and I know satellites have been used for other things like cross-border conflict, mass graves, human rights violations in Sri Lanka after the conflict, etc. I know there's been some work by Amnesty International and George Clooney on South Sudan, but is Nottingham the first place to turn its attention to slavery using satellites? Absolutely.
Slavery per se, yeah, we are. I'm really proud of that.
That's great. If I again back up a little bit, I mean, you describe yourself as someone who works on Earth observation, and that was a term I hadn't heard before coming to this part of the world, and I like the term, but it's also predicated on the idea that every human activity on Earth leaves some sort of discernible trace, and some of that is not discernible from space, but some of it is. So that the general proposition around the discernible traces of human activity helps you identify these sites of slavery. So what are the sorts of things that you have been looking at where we think there is a trace that can be observed from space that helps us do that kind of work?
Okay, the biggest impact we've had is looking at the brick kilns. So To give you an example of why we've gone for brick kilns, one, we can see them from space. They're pretty big. You know, some of the ones that where slavery is prevalent, the brick kilns are about 100 metres across by about 30 metres wide. So, and they're oval in shape. They have a chimney. You know, they have a unique signature. You can't mix them up with something else. And the other reason why we've gone for the brick kilns, our first big project, is because the statistic out there is about 70% of the workforce in these kilns are bonded in their labour practices. So, you know, that slavery is prevalent here.
So there's a high probability that slaves are associated with the industry. Give us a sense of the scale then. What countries are the brick kilns in? How many are they? What's the geographical area that they cover?
Yeah. So what we've focused on, first of all, is an area called the Brick Belt, and this has been coined by the NGOs working in the area, looking at slavery. And that is about 1.5 million square kilometres. That's a huge area. So really the only way you can actually count these brick kilns is going to be from space using Earth observation. And that covers the northern part of India, covers Pakistan, from Bangladesh, into Nepal. Quite a few countries included in this definition.
So you have a certain percentage of slaves involved in brick kiln, but that only makes up a certain percentage of slaves overall, because the case of India, for example, Walk Free reports that in the Global Slavery Index of this year that they're up to 18 million slaves in India. And a lot of the activity, of course, that involves slavery you couldn't see from space. So garment factories or other production processes, perhaps even in the extractive industries, you might be able to see where extractives are being taken out, so lithium, cobalt, bauxite, hard metals, minerals, those sorts of things. But it may be that you can't really identify slavery. But I'm still curious about this use of images. So you can aggregate images across different satellite sourcing. How many images are there, and how do you sort through them? Are you going hand by hand, you know, looking at images, or is there some way a computer can help you?
So the initial project literally was hand by hand. You know, it was visual interpretation, but as you've intimated, there's a lot of images to go through. Yeah. So we've used the free imagery source from Google Earth, which is brilliant, and you know, brick kilns are there for a long time, so we don't have to have the most up-to-date imagery. So Google Earth is great for that because it doesn't have the up-to-date stuff. But go back a year, and you're fine. What we did there is use a statistical inference approach. So we set up a random sample across the brick belt area, and we came up with a number of cells that we needed to sample. So randomly we visited 320 areas across the brick belt. And literally, we had someone count the number of brick kilns in that area. So you look from that sample, then you can make an inference, because it's a random sample. You can use basic inferential statistics, which is that every cell had the equal chance of being selected in your sample, and therefore the number of brick kilns you count per cell. You can then say, okay, well, if there are 35% across this number of cells, if we aggregate that to the total land population, we then know there are roughly this many kilns. That's the basic. And what's attractive about that is that you can do that then anywhere. So we've done it for the brick belt, and we've done it for brick kilns, but there's no reason why you couldn't adopt that methodology and do it somewhere else on a different type of slavery activity. And I think that's really attractive to the non-governmental organisations who don't have a lot of money and are looking for robust evidence by which they can say these are the number of slaves operating in a particular area. We'll get to what you do with the evidence in a minute, but I'm also still interested in this process of inference, because it sounds a bit like estimating the size of a forest, right? You can take a random sample of a wooded area, count the number of trees in the wooded area, and then make an inference to the total number of trees. That's a similar inferential process, right? Absolutely. Yeah. Because a lot of what the counting of slaves and human rights violations use this thing called multiple systems estimation, and that's based on a statistical technique that was used to count fish. So here we're using a statistical technique that was used to count trees to actually count slaves, or at least count the areas where the high probability of slavery exists. And I was really struck by something you said about the up-to-date image, the notion that the brick kiln doesn't change much over time. It's a fixture, it's a fixed piece of infrastructure in that sense. Whereas if you're monitoring conflict or cross-border conflict, it may be that rebels come, troops come, Russians invade Crimea, and then they leave. You have a short period of time to verify what's happening. Whereas in this area of work, these things have been around for quite some time, and you can actually judge to whether they're active or inactive, I suppose, from smoke formation coming out of the chimneys and things like that, right? Absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
So then we get to this case of what do we then do with the evidence? Presumably you can build a file, you can build a case, you can submit the evidence to an NGO or some sort of international organization, and then they can put pressure on governments and say, look, we've identified all of this, we think there's a problem here. Then what happens? What
we're driving towards is the fact that people who carry out slavery activity can't hide.
Right.
Okay, the evidence is there, it's on a photograph, if you like.
Yeah.
I think the key thing from an NGO point of view is that perhaps they don't know every single brick kiln in this particular example, case study, and we can map the locations for them, which is the next stage in the project. What they do with that next, yes, they can go to local enforcement agencies to discuss the fact that there's a number of brick kilns in this area based on the prevalence that we know from other brick kilns, and you can infer that there may be slavery activity going on.
So really, the slavery from space needs to be combined with some ground truthing and some interventions at the local level, with a combination of law enforcement officials, government officials, local government, plus NGO activity. And of course, that will vary considerably in terms of the quality of governance within a country. So there's an interaction between the sort of quality of governance, level of development, number of other features of the country, and the propensity for agencies to actually do anything about the problem, I suppose.
Absolutely. But if I can interject,
sure.
There, I think the key thing here is that it's a methodology that you can't hide from. It's a methodology that is similar or exactly the same in terms of how you conduct it right across the piece.
Right.
So it's based on data that has been collected through a technological and scientific process that can't be disputed. Yeah, you can dispute perhaps the interpretation of it, but the way the imagery are served and the way it's captured, you can't dispute that. That's there. The brick kiln is there.
There's there. It doesn't move.
There's no hiding. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, you're making assumptions about who's in the brick kiln and who's working it, but that's secondary to actually identifying the geolocation of that and the population that may be involved in that. So brick kilns is one industry. You've also looked, I understand it, at fisheries. Can you tell us a little bit about the fishing industry?
So this is where we started. Kevin Bales, one of my colleagues on this particular project, he said to us, hang on, we can see some fish farms located in the Sundarbans National Park. So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There should be nothing in the mangroves in this particular area, India and Bangladesh. So again, we looked at Google Earth, and there they are. You cannot mix them up with anything else, misinterpret them. They are there.
Yeah.
And the great thing with Google Earth, because it's been going now for, where are we? Oh, a good 15 years or so. We do have historical imagery in there as well, so we can actually see the movement of these farms. And what we're seeing is that some of them have disappeared due to the fact that the mangrove has been cut down to build fish farms. And that's allowed the water level to rise and the water to encroach. So we've again identified where these farms are, and because the imagery is based on a particular technology, and the pixel sizes, you can actually estimate how much area of mangrove has been lost. So so you can talk to different people. You can talk to environmentalists and say, look, this is going on, and then what you do, you start to build up a force behind you to basically eradicate slavery. So it's not just the human rights activists who need to be involved here and interested, it is the environmentalists as well. And actually all of us, because you start to cut down forests, then obviously that has implications for climate change.
Sure. And so what's really interesting about this example is you have a culturally protected site. Nothing's supposed to be there because it's meant to be this beautiful nirvana of natural beauty.
Absolutely.
UNESCO has protected it. There's a commitment internationally to protect it, and all of a sudden from space you see there's a infrastructure down there of some kind. Further observation tells you that this is a fishery. Fishes are raised, a bit of ground truthing takes place, and you see in fact that there were kids employed who were not employed, just sort of conscripted to work on the fishery, and then you start to have this sort of corroborated case of identification of slavery. Now I was struck by another thing you said there, two things actually. One was that because Google Earth has been around for 15 years, you can actually watch things over time, and that's something that may not occur to our listeners, that you can have repeated images of the same location and see the sorts of change that might have taken place. So it may have started out with just maybe one small little fishing activity, and then that activity grows. So there's a way of looking at the patterns of growth and the change in these things. The other thing you said to me that didn't quite register when we first started discussing this issue is that there's a relationship between the number of pixels and the geographical space that is being estimated. So there's a ratio of pixels to square footage, right, or square meterage, right? So that allows you to be very precise about the sorts of land that's being encroached upon, right?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this is great. And then there's another example, I think, that's been raised, which is charcoal production. So I understand this takes place in parts of Brazil, and you've been doing some work on that as well. Is that right?
Yeah, this is a lot more challenging.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea there is that the type of charcoal production is very small scale. So when you look at images of deforestation in the Amazon, it tends to be clear-cut, really easy to see. But the type of charcoal production that uses slave labour tends to be very small, understory type removal of the wood.
Yeah.
And that's a bit more challenging to see from space. So we might need to think about perhaps alternative methods there. Or what we need to think about is working with people that are on the ground, or certainly in countries that are able to tell us, perhaps we need to look in this area.
Right.
And then we can start to develop techniques using the data sets that are there for that particular area. Some of what we call the optical data, so these are like photograph-like data, might not be relevant here. So we might need to think about other techniques, so things like laser scanning, or things like using radar, which kind of penetrates through the upper canopy, and then it might tell you what's going on below.
Yeah, I mean, there was this recent study that discovered many more Mayan cities than we thought existed in the first place. That the archaeologists have told us, you know, from the rise of Stela and the fall of Stela, sort of beginning and end dates of Mayan city-states, etc. But this new study is basically using lasers to cut through the canopy of the very thick Guatemalan jungle, and lo and behold, we find, you know, numerous Mayan city-states. I think this holds promise for some of the work in human rights and certainly in slavery, that things that are undetected under the canopy, or maybe happened some years ago and have been covered up, nevertheless might be discoverable by these new technologies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's not without risk, right? So we can sit here and use satellites and observe things from a very safe distance, thousands of miles above the surface of the Earth, but when we activate local groups, there's some risk in where they can go, how they can engage, and it's not all, you know, good progress. There's a lot of setbacks and some danger around this work.
Yeah, I think that ethical dimension is really important here.
Right.
Absolutely. But there's, you know, technology coming on stream. For instance, we can use unmanned aerial vehicles. So we can still do a bit of, we can sit here and deploy something. So, you know, that's an exciting development that we should follow.
Well, drones get a lot of bad press. So here we can say, you know, drones for good.
Absolutely. Drones, yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of examples of drones for good.
Yeah.
You know, so drones are being used to plant seedlings, to reforest them. Yeah, so, you know, there is that kind of backlash against the drones for bad happening.
Yeah,
definitely.
And I guess just to wrap up, Doreen, you made references to the environmental connection, and because you've been working on environment for a long time in your career, there's a real nexus here between slavery, the prevalence of slavery, environmental destruction. You talked about deforestation in Brazil. You're talking about deforestation around the fisheries. So in a sense, there's a second benefit to liberating people out of slavery, which might be the environmental benefit. And that's another piece of work you're doing, which we don't have time to talk about. But just in closing, can you say a few words about that connection between slavery and the environment?
I was talking to an NGO recently who said that actually to get people, you know, fired up and doing stuff, then to be able to link that environment and slavery activity together, or environmental destruction and slavery activity together, is a really good way to go forward. So if you think about, everybody does something that will have an impact on the environment, whether you think about it or not.
Yeah.
So, you know, a slavery activity, or an activity that employs, or rather not employs in the conventional sense,
yes.
slave labour, will have an impact on the environment. So you need to think about whether, if you have the brick kilns, for example, I now keep coming back to that, but they will use anything to fuel the firing of the brick. So these are old tyres,
right.
the local forests and so on. And that has implications for emissions of CO2, black soot, and so on into the environment. So if we can start to understand why slavery happens, where it happens, and how it intersects with environmental change, then obviously that has, and we can address both at the same time, then I think we're onto a real winner.
Yeah, and I think the point you make is really important, is that you can almost expand the frame of activity, meaning that the discourse around the activity suddenly brings in a whole new other group of people concerned about change in the world, and linking those two groups together makes the cause that much more powerful. So fascinating to talk with you on this episode of The Rights Track. I think your claim around the hard science, the indisputable science of locating, geolocating activity, corroborating evidence and identifying what's actually happening on the ground, and then using that to mobilize for change is a really powerful story. And it's an honor to meet you and to listen to how you've taken a technology that's been used for so many other things over so many years, and now you're turning the eye in the sky to fight slavery. I think that's fascinating. So thanks very much for being on this episode of The Rights Track.
Okay, thank you, Todd.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Christine Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 3 of the podcast is funded by the Rights Lab, a University of Nottingham programme of research which is working to end modern slavery. You can find out more in our episode show notes, and please subscribe to the podcast for future episodes as we find out more about the research helping to achieve that aim.